Are you positive there's no one else who can cover it? Mrs. Bailey asked, her voice more desperate than she wanted it to sound. No, I understand. Yes, of course. I'm aware of the staff cuts. All right, see you tomorrow. Mrs. Bailey hung up the phone, closed her eyes, and let out a deep, disappointed sigh. I've got some bad news, guys, she told them. It looks like I have to work tomorrow night, so I won't be here for your birthday. But I'll make it up to you. We'll celebrate when I get home from work the next night, all right? That's fine, Mom, Alex said cheerfully, trying to make her feel better. We understand. It's okay, Connor added. We weren't really expecting anything special anyway. The situation made Mrs. Bailey feel like the worst mother in the world, and their understanding made her feel even worse. She would have much rather watch them throw a fit or get angry or show any emotion appropriate for their age. They were too young to be used to disappointment. Oh, Mrs. Bailey said, fighting back the sadness inside her. Great, then we'll have dinner and get a cake and have a nice night. Now I'm just going to go upstairs for a minute before I head back to work. She left the kitchen and hurried up the stairs and into her bedroom. The twins waited a beat before climbing up the stairs to check on her. They peered into their mother's bedroom. She was sitting on her bed crying, with rolled up balls of tissue in both her hands, talking to a framed photo of her late husband. Oh, John, Mrs. Bailey said. I try to stay strong and keep our family going, but it's really hard to do without you. They're such good kids. They don't deserve this. She quickly dried her tears once she felt the twins watching her. Alex and Connor slowly walked into her room and sat on either side of her. I'm so sorry for everything, Mrs. Bailey said to them. It just isn't fair that you've had to go through all of this at such a young age. It's going to be okay, Mom, Alex said. We don't need anything special for our birthday. Birthdays are overrated anyway, Connor added. We know things are tight right now. Mrs. Bailey put her arms around them. When did you two become so grown up? She asked them with watery eyes. I'm the luckiest mom in the world. All their eyes fell on the photo of Mr. Bailey. You know what your dad would say if he were here? Mrs. Bailey asked the twins. He'd say, right now, we're living in an ugly chapter of our lives, but books always get better. The twins smiled at her, hoping this was true. Chapter 3, A Birthday Surprise. Pencils down, Mrs. Peter ordered from the front of the classroom. Her students were taking a math test, and she had been watching them like a prison guard the entire time. Pass your test to the front. Connor looked down at the test as if it were written in ancient hieroglyphics. Most of his answers were blank, and he had just scribbled around the others to make it look like he had tried. He said a little prayer to himself and passed the test forward with the others. The tests were all passed to Alex, who stacked them in a neat pile for Mrs. Peters. She always felt so refreshed after taking a test. Especially one as simple as that one had been for her. Her brother's test caught her eye, since it was the one with the least amount of writing on it. Alex knew Connor always tried his best at school, but his best never seemed to be good enough. She looked back at him, wishing she could help him, and then it occurred to her, maybe she could. Alex looked up at Mrs. Peters and saw that she was busy looking at the notes in her lesson plan. Would her teacher notice if Alex quickly filled in a couple of answers for her brother? Was Alex even capable of doing something so blatantly wrong? Was it considered cheating if you were doing it on someone else's test? Would the gracious gesture cancel out the offense in the grand scheme of things? Alex was prone to overthinking everything, so she just did it. She quickly filled in some of her brother's answers, making her handwriting slightly sloppier than it usually was, and handed the stack of tests to Mrs. Peters. It was the most spontaneous thing she had ever done. Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Miss Bailey, Mrs. Peters said, making eye contact with her. Alex felt like the pit of her stomach had fallen out of her body. The excitement she had felt from her impulse was now overshadowed by guilt. Mrs. Peters had always trusted her. How could she do something so juvenile? Should she confess what she had done? What was the punishment for her crime? Would she feel this guilty for the rest of her life? She looked back at her brother. Connor let out a long but quiet sigh, and Alex sensed her brother's sadness and embarrassment. She could feel his hopelessness as if it were her own. The critical wheels in Alex's head stopped turning. She knew she'd done the right thing, not as a student, but as a sister. I want you all to get out your homework from the last night, Mrs. Peters commanded, and I would like you to briefly present your work in front of the class. The teacher regularly surprised the class with impromptu presentations to keep them on their toes. She took a seat on a stool in the back of the room, uncomfortably close to Connor's seat, so she could keep an eye on his consciousness. One by one, the students presented their assignments to the class. Besides a boy who thought Jack and the Beanstalk was about an alien abduction and a girl who claimed Puss in Boots was an early example of animal cruelty, all the students seemed to have interpreted the tales correctly. It was so hard to choose just one fairy tale to write about, Alex said as she animatedly presented her 7-page paper to the class. So I selected the story, the theme of which is present in virtually every fairy tale and every story ever written, Cinderella. Her excitement was not shared by her peers. Many people have had issues with Cinderella, saying it has anti-feminist elements. Alex continued, but I think that's completely ridiculous. Cinderella is not about a man saving a woman. It's about karma. Most of the class began daydreaming about other things. Mrs. Peters was the only person in the room who seemed even slightly interested in what Alex had to say. Think about it, Alex went on. Even after years of constant abuse from her stepmother and her stepsisters, Cinderella remained a good person with high hopes. She never stopped believing in herself and in the good of the world. And although she married the prince in the end, Cinderella always had inner happiness. Her story shows that even in the worst of situations, even when it seems no one in the world appreciates you, as long as you have hope, everything can get better. Alex let her mind linger on what she had said. She questioned the last point she had made in her presentation. Was that really what Cinderella was about? Or was it what she needed Cinderella to be about? Thank you, Miss Bailey. Very well said, Mrs. Peters said, with the closest thing to a smile her face was capable of making. Thank you for your time, Alex said, and nodded to the class. It's your turn, Mr. Bailey, the teacher announced. She was sitting so close to him that he could feel the warm breath from her nostrils on the back of his neck. Connor went to the front of the classroom, dragging his feet as if he were encased in concrete. He had never had trouble talking in front of the class, but he'd rather be anywhere in the world than presenting something in front of the teacher. Alex gave him an encouraging nod. I chose The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Connor said, going against his sister's advice from the day before. Alex slumped in her seat, and Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes. This was very disappointing. I know you're all expecting I went with the easiest one, Connor said. Except reading it again, I don't think the story is about the importance of honesty. I think it's about high expectations. Alex and Mrs. Peters both raised an eyebrow. Where was he going with this? Sure, the boy was a brat. I can't deny that, Connor continued, gesturing to the half-page brat paper he had written. But can you blame him for having a little fun? Clearly his village was having a bit of a wolf problem, and everyone was stressed out about it. He was just a kid. Did they really expect him to be perfect all the time? His presentation may not have been the best, but it certainly was catching the class's attention. And it makes me wonder, why was no one watching this kid? Connor asked. Maybe if his parents had kept an eye on him, he wouldn't have been eaten. I think the story is trying to tell us to keep an eye on our kids, especially if they're pathological liars. Thank you. Connor never tried to be funny. He was just painfully honest about his thoughts and opinions. This honesty always amused his classmates, but never his teacher. Thank you, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said sharply. You may sit down now. Connor knew he'd blown it. He took his seat, resuming his position under his teacher's cold stare and warm breath. Why did he even bother trying anymore? It wasn't the end of a school day unless Connor left feeling completely worthless. There was only one person who was capable of making him feel better when he felt this way. Connor only wished he was still around.